That's because if you look at a map, you see that Azerbaijan is the route south to Iran. It is the way in order to get to the Persian Gulf. It is part of a historical Russian theosophic tradition, if you will. And Georgia is a way toward that. The Russians understand very well that relying on Armenia alone in the South Caucasus does not get them what they want. They will never be able to make progress in expanding their influence in Azerbaijan unless they have a more positive relationship with Georgia. Consequence, Georgia has a political resource that can deny Russia that access, and that's an interest that Georgia can play. If I were the Georgian foreign minister, I would understand every time I talk to the Russian foreign minister that the Russian foreign minister needs me just as much as I may need him. And when you're in a situation like that, all kinds of possible openings are there. So the first is a cultural thing. The Russians are really, especially this leadership, very obsessed with a Christian Georgia in a region that isn't Christian, is increasingly not Christian. Okay? Second, they're really interested in using Georgia as a means to get to Azerbaijan because Armenia is not going to get them there. The Karabakh dispute precludes Armenia playing that role, but Georgia has something Russia wants. And because Georgia has something Russia wants, it can make certain demands to be cooperative. Georgia has more resources than Georgians think. The third thing is something else, and that is we have forgotten one of the most important realities about the North Caucasus. If you go back 300 years, no government, no Russian government, not in St. Petersburg in imperial times, not Moscow in Soviet times, not Moscow in post-Soviet times, has ever been able to control the North Caucasus until it has a dominant position in the South Caucasus. It has never been able to establish Russian control over the peoples of the North Caucasian republics. Therefore, Moscow is very interested in finding ways to have the three countries in the South Caucasus, and the frontline states, if you will, are Georgia and Azerbaijan, becoming cooperative with Russia so that Russia has some hope of holding the North Caucasus. My own personal view is that Russia is going to lose the North Caucasus, and I think the Russians are terrified of that. But I think what that means is that some of the things that Georgia can offer in a cooperative way, in exchange for things Georgia wants, Georgians should keep in mind that Russia desperately needs the cooperation of the countries of the South Caucasus, especially Georgia and Azerbaijan. The Abkhaz are not Turks. The Abkhaz have their own national agenda that is broader and deeper than that. The Russians are primitives when it comes to analyzing Islam. They're slightly worse than the Americans. And it's the minute somebody says Muslim, people assume disaster. That's not the case. I think that the Russians never were going to control Abkhazia. I think the Abkhaz have manipulated the Russians, and that has two consequences from a Georgian perspective. On the one hand, it means Moscow may at some point decide to sell out the Abkhazians to the Georgians in order to advance Russian national interests. Russia's national interests do not consist of supporting Abkhazia now and forever. The Russians have betrayed any number of people after initially supporting them. And it's entirely possible within the next 5 years that the Russian government will see Abkhazia as a threat, as a bridge from the Black Sea into the northwestern Caucasus, causing Russia to lose even more control over a broader area in the North Caucasus. And if that happens, the Russian government will only be too pleased, I'm convinced, to turn to Georgia to help control Abkhazia again. Is this going to happen next week? Probably not. Is it going to happen over the next several years? I think it's entirely possible, and I think Georgians should remember that. The other is that the Abkhaz have been busily subverting Russian interests. If they're not behaving as a pure Russian tool, if you will. The Russians wish they had a different government in Abkhazia than they do. I think it's important for Georgians to understand that the government in Abkhazia is not a branch office of Moscow. I think the situation in South Ossetia is different. I think South Ossetia is a branch office of Moscow. And I think it's very important, if Georgia is going to play a sophisticated policy to recover these territories and maximize its own standing as a state, that Georgians understand very, very well that the government in Abkhazia is not simply a Russian agent. That doesn't mean they're not sometimes working for the Russians, but they're not simply that. And that's something that I think Georgians should pay attention to. There's a tendency, from what I can see of the Georgian media, and I don't read Georgian, so I'm limited, but there's a tendency to act as if we read what Moscow is saying, we know what Sukhumi is thinking. And I don't think that's true. I think that there's a big difference, and it's not just because of the departure of ethnic Russians, and it's not just because of the influence of Turkey, and it's not just because of the growing number of Muslims there. It is a reflection that the Abkhaz have a national agenda which is very different than the Russian Federation. That's why I said, I can imagine a day when, if Georgia could legitimately say to a Russian ambassador or negotiator that, well, if you're going to insist on Abkhazia remaining independent, maybe we'll recognize them and ask our friends, the Europeans, to do the same thing. Were that to happen, I think you would be amazed at how fast the Russian government would come around. Because Western recognition of Abkhazia, as unpleasant as it would be for Georgia at one level, would be far more unpleasant to the Russians. And that doesn't mean you have to do it, but the fact that you could do it, it's like being a labor union organizer. Labor unions are the strongest when they threaten a strike, not when they go out on strike. Georgians, I think, need to be very sophisticated, but sophistication requires that you understand how many resources you have and not just how much weakness you've got. I really do think that the Georgians need to get over some of their paranoia. It's very hard. I remember talking to Leonard Meri, who was president of Estonia and probably my closest friend other than family. And I used to say, you know, you've got to stop obsessing about Russia. You know, I mean, yes, they're a big, unpleasant country next door. And he said, well, it's really easy for you to say this. You have the Atlantic Ocean between yourself and them. But if you're looking down the barrel of a gun, of a Russian tank, it's a little more difficult. Yes, it is. But only as places like Estonia and to a lesser extent Latvia and Lithuania have become more sophisticated and realized that the Russians do not hold all the cards, have they been able to achieve more vis-a-vis Moscow. Don't be afraid. Know that it's a dangerous situation, a bad neighborhood, but Georgia has real resources and it needs to focus on those, because not only will that allow it to be more genuinely self-confident, but it will guarantee that over time Georgia can achieve more of what it wants, because, to be blunt, the Russians are not in good shape in this part of the world either. Yes, when the tanks are rolling, their tanks outnumber your tanks. But let's be clear, that's not what power is about in this day and age. I would hope that the new government would make the following declarations. First, Georgia remains committed to the recovery of its territories. Those are Georgian territories, and there's no change in that. And that we want to develop good relations with Russia, but that will require a modification of the Russian position on that. Second, whether that happens or not, Georgia will proceed with integrating with NATO and the European Union. Indeed, Georgia understands that it will get into the EU and into NATO sooner by displaying a cooperative attitude toward Russia rather than an antagonistic one. And third, to understand that Georgia has been around for 2,500 years as a state, and there is no reason it shouldn't be around for 2,500 more years. Don't assume that just because there's been a loss in 2008, that that's the beginning of the end. In fact, there have been worse times in Georgian history. I used to tell people in the Baltic countries when I was actively involved there that if somebody had 10 years ago told you that these would be your problems, you would say, bring it on, bring it on. If only we could get to the point where those were our problems. You know, when I think where Georgia was in 1980 and where Georgia is today, Georgia is a success story. And Georgians shouldn't rest on their laurels. You can't when you're a small country in a bad neighborhood. But the fact is that despite August 2008, Georgia has made progress. Georgians should be proud, and Georgians should realize that almost more than any other country in what was the Soviet Union, because the Baltic countries were never part of the Soviet Union, more than any other country, Georgia has a realistic chance to be a member of NATO and a member of the European Union within this decade.